The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Now, two pigeons bemoaning the fact you can stream DirecTV satellite-free.
These humans can stream all the top-rated national news channels on DirecTV, and now with no satellite dish.
This just in. Weather, sports, election coverage. DirecTV has it all, but something is missing. The satellite dish.
What are you doing?
I'm reporting the news. Back to you, Bob.
Here's some news. You're a buffoon.
Stream the top-rated national news channels. No satellite dish. Visit DirecTV.com. Internet required. Top-rated news based on 2023 Nielsen ratings.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit Shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Kia ora tātou, this is Gone by Lunchtime. My name is Toby Manhire, and huge cast of experts with me today, including Annabelle Mather. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
And Ben Thomas. Kia ora, Ben Thomas.
Kia ora.
Te Ahi Butler is here, making it all magic, despite having had a chest infection.
Just a little one.
Recovered from.
Just a cute little spring one.
He's been going on about it all week. No, he hasn't at all.
The lung transplant was very successful, though, apparently, so that's good.
Successful. Have you considered trying some of these heated tobacco products? Unfortunately, they're not available in the shops as of today.
I've had some great independent advice that I should try it, and I'm thinking about it.
Okay, Jesus Christ. All right. We will talk about that maybe briefly along the Casey Costello latest episode in that particular adventure. Maths funding and te reo funding, we'll get into that. We'll travel to Dunedin to discuss the situation with the hospital. But first, let's talk about tax, because everyone loves to talk about tax. And there's no way to sell a podcast quite like talking about tax. This was capital gains tax has returned in its Sisyphean way to the New Zealand headlines.
What's Sisyphean?
Like when you're pushing a rock up a hill and the rock keeps moving. You know, Sisyphus was condemned to push a rock up a hill, I think. Is that right, Ben? Classical scholar?
Yes, he's in Hades, and what was it? What did they call the underworld? I can't remember. But he was pushing a rock uphill forever, and then it would like roll down, and he would push it up again.
You know what he should have done? Should have refettled the rock. That would have solved. That would have solved the problem. Moving right along, Antonia Watson, the CEO of ANZ, was interviewed by Guy and Espen on his 30 program on RNZ, and she said that capital gains tax seemed like a fair idea. She wasn't sure what was likely to happen, but she said it was a fair idea, and that came after there'd been a bit of a re-emergence of the long-running Labour conversation around whether or not they will offer different, what they call progressive tax options. Remember before the last election, David Parker, supported by Grant Robertson, attempted to look at wealth tax, or that got killed. Long-running adventures in capital gains taxes for Labour have come a cropper. The Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, scoffed at the CEO of ANZ, saying, I love it that the CEO of a big bank from Australia wants to take more money off New Zealanders. And then Nicola Willis was on Morning Report talking about capital gains tax and saying that, interestingly, which attracted a bit of attention, that capital gains tax would be a disincentive to the likes of people considering setting up a mechanics business or an interior decorating business, which prompted a lot of people to saying actually it's the very opposite. And that point that maybe we'll discuss in a second. It's Ben, you love a tax chat. You think tax is love, if I recall correctly. What do you make of this debate? Two parts to it, really. One is whether or not the case is one that is coherent and might get across the line, remembering, of course, that the IMF want a capital gains tax, the OECD like a capital gains tax. As we reminded routinely, New Zealand is the only country, I think, in the OECD that doesn't have a comprehensive gains tax, remembering also that we do have various versions of capital gains tax in the system. We just don't have a comprehensive one. That was the first part of my lengthy question, and the second one is whether or not it is politically viable, remembering, of course, that Jacinda Ardern did an old, not in the whole course of my career as a politician, shall I ever, ever, ever try to get a CGT again after Winston Peters handbraked it hard. Can you cover all of that concisely, please, Ben? And I'm sorry.
Yeah, so returning to our earlier discussion, the capital gains tax is a boulder that Labour leaders condemned for eternity to push up to a hill, labelled as if by a US political cartoonist, general election, which then, when they're near the top, rolls back over the top of them, flattening them down to the bottom of the hill again, to be sort of picked up by the next Labour leader. Politically, the common wisdom is that a capital gains tax is political suicide, quote unquote. But like a lot of cliches, it's true. We've seen Labour leaders in the past. They tend to be the ones who sort of advance it and who are taken seriously when they advance it. Absolutely sort of flummoxed and destroyed in the air when it comes to queries about, well, you're going to exclude the family home, but what counts as the family home? What about a home that's held in trust? What about a home that your grandparents have promised you that you lived in as a child? But and the complexities generally sink it. You'd be a very, very brave person to advance a capital gains tax without having covered off all of the bases to a level of detail that may be impossible in opposition.
Briefly on that, there are a bunch of taxes. New Zealand has a relatively, and compared to much of the world, simple tax system, but there are still a number of taxes where if people were expected to, pass a kind of master's level tax exam, which is what's happened in election campaigns in the past, maybe it's just that Labour's not known how to deal with those questions rather than not knowing every single encyclopedic detail.
Well, yeah, but it's also the question of, nobody is running on introducing those taxes. Or if they are, they're taxes that affect other people, the GST on tech platforms or whatever. It's very difficult when it seems like it's something that you will be taxed on and the party that's proposing it can't really explain the full extent of it. The other thing is that the major sort of safeguard or guardrail that the parties put in to try and safeguard themselves politically is we won't tax the family home. That won't be subject to a capital gains tax. And as soon as you exempt the family home, you blow out all of the supposed benefits of the capital gains tax out of the water. What the sort of criticism, and Hayden Donnell wrote a piece about this for the spin-off. The criticism, or one of the major arguments for a capital gains tax in New Zealand is that we tend to overinvest in property, real estate, and underinvest in productive business. A capital gains tax, so the thinking goes, would disincentivize property investment, get people investing in their mechanics business, their floristry business, all that sort of thing. Except it wouldn't. It would just encourage everyone, including small business people who generally finance their businesses off mortgages on their homes, to invest more in their family homes to get capital gains in a way that isn't taxed. So
it'd be great for conservatories. Everyone will put a conservatory.
It would be great for conservatories. It would be great for small businesses who provide kitchen countertops. It would be, but that would be a very small and targeted kind of economic stimulus,
but
which doesn't really probably demand ending the tax system.
Christopher Luxon in the long-running fairy tale of Premier House Annabelle has been dragged into this debate this week, and I don't think we necessarily need to personalise it to Christopher Luxon, except to say, because there have been questions about whether or not the bright line test being shortened under the national government meant that he was able to cash the capital gain on his apartment. Forget that. People like Christopher Luxon, including Christopher Luxon, own a whole stack of investment properties because that's a rational good idea, because they're smart, because you would. Isn't that the most powerful argument about introducing a capital gains tax? That people who are smart and see where the best ways to make money in New Zealand invest their money is invest it in buying another flat and then another house and then another apartment and then renting them out.
That's right. And also, I mean, I don't think that a capital gains tax is going to encourage people with SMEs or literally the family that own their one family home to invest in business. I think it's more targeted towards people who own, 5, 10, 15, 20 rental properties or more to instead invest in, productive businesses. I think Ben's right. Of course, it is the cliche that it's political suicide to support a capital gains tax. But I do think that there is a shift in New Zealand in people's attitude, that more and more people are seeing the inequity that it creates, the problem that it creates in terms of heating up the housing market, the unfairness that poor people's only asset is their labour and they're taxed on it, but you can have someone who is, wealthy, who owns houses, making capital gains tax and not paying anything on it. So I do think that the time is right for Labour to be launching and testing some policy ideas so that by the time the election rolls around, the spittle has dried on people's faces, the heat has kind of been taken out of the argument, and they're able to go into the election with a fairly firm policy that's been well debated. I did think it was a little bit ironic, Carmel Sepuloni's statements in the media this week about, it's time National ponied up and did something. Labour literally had 6 years and wouldn't, right to the dying breaths of their government. So in terms of Luxon, Bryce Edwards did an interesting column yesterday questioning whether or not New Zealand politicians have a conflict of interest when it comes to housing policy, because so many parliamentarians own houses, particularly in National. And it made me think about how, in terms of treaty settlements, you can't have a Minister of Treaty Settlements who's Māori because it's considered a conflict of interest. You can have parliamentarians voting on housing policies that they directly benefit from. So it's an interesting, how could you get around it? You can't. The parliamentarians have to be there to legislate.
I mean, there are two parts to it in a way.
Steve Abel. Steve Abel should be the Minister of Housing because he lives in a tree like at least a quarter of the year, right?
Well, he once lived in a tree, and many capital gains made from that tree. I guess the question in a way, Ben, is in two parts. One is whether or not a capital gains tax would be a fair part of an overall tax system, which I think is what Antonia Watson's point was. And the other one is that the tax system is not fit for purpose to raise the revenue required to fund a health system and a superannuation system and the rest over the years to come, right? And I think the most likely way of a capital gains tax being introduced into the system is by doing what's, a revenue neutral approach, which we've seen before in various tax switches, they're sometimes called. That might be that you push down company tax, so you make it explicit that it's been designed to drive productivity in the economy. But those two, once they get conflated, isn't that where the problem lies?
Yeah, I think it's. Someone smarter than me could probably answer this, but I think there's technical problems in
Annabelle
trying to make a revenue neutral kind of tax switch to capital gains, in the sense that any capital gains tax can't be retrospective, so it's only going to be capital gains from the point at which it passes. So it's slow
on realised capital gains.
Yeah. Whereas and that becomes much more difficult to sort of just say, well, we're going to make this a revenue neutral tax switch, because it's more difficult to phase out something like, say, GST or income tax, and I think you'd have to do it on those. To get everyday voters who are worried about their rental properties, etc., on board, as opposed to, I think if you said we're going to introduce a capital gains tax on people's second homes and their shares and everything that they've got and their KiwiSaver probably, but we're not going to. But don't worry, we're going to reduce company tax at the same time. I think that would be a really good way to lose an election pretty quickly. I just want to return to the Christopher Luxon issue. I think he seems to get himself into these situations a little bit more regularly than some prime ministers do. And as he said to Heather du Plessis-Allen, and I think maybe RNZ yesterday, it's because he's wealthy. He admits it.
I get it. I get it.
I kept flashing. And he finds himself sort of stranded in these interviews without a really good line. And he just said, I get it. I'm wealthy.
He's got that's a go-to line, right? Like if you feel as though someone's saying something that makes you feel uncomfortable because it sounds like they might have a point or somewhere we're being more vulnerable, you just go with "I get it."
Yeah,
and then
it diffuses the whole thing.
I get it.
Yeah,
it made me think of. It made me think of like Elon Musk on stage with Dave Chappelle, sort of where he was sort of being booed and he couldn't think of anything to say. And he's like, I'm rich, bitch. and the thing is, like, John Key was always really good at that because he would always deflect it into, look, I know what it's like to, go without, to be worried about paying the power bill. I give my wages, I give my salary as PM to charity. All of my assets are in a blind trust. And Luxon hasn't put in place any of that sort of narrative stuff. He has, I think on News Talk yesterday, he was saying, look, I've said before, both my parents left school at 16. I went to university. And he's sort of like, are you going to have to make me tell my human story again? Don't you get it? and I think Luxon has looked sort of irritable and kind of, near the end of his tether in pretty much every interview or stand-up I've seen with him in probably the last 3 or 4 weeks. And sort of, kind of particularly defensive, not just about, this sort of, I guess, questions he would regard as kind of overly personal and sort of none of people's business, but, also about policy, even sort of softball interviews with Mike Hosking. He's been quite defensive, and I'm not quite sure what's happening there, but whether the sort of improved leadership figures or personal ratings from the Taxpayers Union might kind of help calm that down, I'm not sure. But
holiday vibes.
Yeah. He needs to go to where was it? He went on holiday? Te Awamusa or Te Kuiti or
That's so sad, really.
Where was it? I forget. And then he did that post, and then he was actually in Hawaii. That's what I was saying. You remember that? That was
right,
That was fine. That's fine.
Yeah. Don't talk about it.
Speaking of John Key, by the way, did you see the item on 3 News?
With Sam?
With Sam Hazen in his helicopter? It was quite weird. Like, I mean, there's definitely a story in there, and that it was John Key, former Prime Minister, thinks that Donald Trump will and should win the election. But most of the story was like, check out my helicopter. This helicopter is so cool. You won't believe what I can do in this helicopter. And it was like... I just thought, what's going on here? What was the conversation? Do you want to see my cool helicopter?
I
suspect around my cool helicopter.
In retirement, that's probably an accurate reflection of kind of John Key's mix of discussion.
Yeah,
it's a 10% like acute analysis of world politics. 90%. Have you seen this cool helicopter that I love piloting?
It was weird. But maybe it's there as something for Christopher Luxon to look forward to if he can suffer his way through these annoying, indefatigable journalists with their pesky questions. One day he too can be on the news just talking about his cool helicopter.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit Shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
The front page of the Otago Daily Times, Annabelle, on Friday, had splashed across the middle of it the word abandoned, and then a whole bunch of coverage about the decision the decision not to make a decision on the long-promised Dunedin Hospital.
The decision to review the decision.
The decision to review the decision, which had been an important kind of part of the campaign pledge from National, but the cost has risen. Then the next day they were
quite promisey about it.
Quite promisey. There were 35,000 people who remembered that promisiness on the streets of Dunedin, and that's a lot of people.
That's almost as many as what they have for like O Week, isn't it?
that's
Has there ever been a meeting
Street,
of that many sober
Castle
Dunedians?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's right. And that's when the hospital is full also, as it happens.
These guys, they need their hospital.
I don't know if there were any sofas that were burned during the protest, but hopefully.
Yeah. They're like, there's a whole new batch of freshers coming in. We need the new rheumatic fever wing completed soon.
These stomachs won't pump themselves, people.
Important issue. I wondered whether or not there was a possibility that the government might have underestimated the response there, that these local issues, it's not just Dunedin. I remember spending some time in Nelson before the local elections, and the fate of the hospital there was a huge talking point. That's, even though that's not really a local government issue, there are other parts of the country, parts of the north, Tauranga, Whangarei, that have hospitals, so this is probably part of the reason that it's felt that the national government feels that it's important to say we can't just write a check for $3 billion because there are a whole lot of other priorities as well. There are trade-offs, as we're reminded. Do you think they underestimated the strength of feeling there?
Absolutely. And to be fair, I think most New Zealanders were surprised by how big that turnout was in Dunedin. And you can understand why they feel so strongly about it, because the South Island seems to have been completely disregarded by this government. We've had the ferries being cancelled. We've had this issue pop up. Of course, like you say, this is try giving birth in Northland. It's like a game of Survivor up there. I think they have, and I imagine that what we might see is a little bit of fudging, like when the additional cancer treatment wasn't included in the budget, and we'll probably get a little bit of a backtrack and a fudge up, and a review of the decision to review the decision will probably get underway shortly.
If you're a quote unquote politics watcher, you can think, the big issue of today is, will Labor run with the capital gains tax in the next election? But of course, for people in Dunedin, the big political issue is, how long am I waiting at the ED to get treatment? How long does it take to get an X-ray? These are the things that actually really personally bite on people's lives, and it can be easy to sort of gloss over that in the excitement of a new government, which has a treaty principles bill and all that sort of stuff. You might sort of question the timing. Obviously, Health NZ came out pretty quickly and said, well, we could look at privately built and privately run hospitals. So, whether there was a sort of sequencing issue there in order to, I don't think it changes the substance of the issue, but whether there was a sort of sequencing thing there to kind of try and introduce that into the debate. That's something that's been discussed for quite a long time. There's already quite a lot of private provision in the public system already. There's a lot of contracting out, a lot of use of private hospital facilities. So, it's not as if this would be a grand step change. And there are, I think, as the Health New Zealand official in the media said, there are a whole number of steps within sort of private provision of public healthcare, short of, full build and running. And that's going to have to be part of the mix. Part of the issue, though, I think, as Dr. Retty said, the most obvious benefit of some sort of PPP arrangement is that it frees up government capital to be used elsewhere. And I think this is sort of a bit of a continuing theme, not just with this government, but previously as well, where there is a bit of a confusion, I think, between finance and funding. You still have to pay for things in the end. You can put it off, you can defer it, but if you're engaged with a private provider, they're still going to want an ordinary rate of return on their investment of capital, the same way that you would want a return on your capital, and that lenders would want a return on any money they advance to the government through bonds. You can't get away from the fact that somebody is going to have to pay for this in the end, whether it's, elderly people via capital gains tax in the future, whether it's user pays, which we are seeing more of, and more plans for under this government. That was a very deliberate step, income tax cuts, but in part offset by greater fees and levies. So, there does have to be a slightly fuller discussion about, where the money will come from eventually.
We have quite a terrifying attitude in this country towards infrastructure investment, hey? We have such a deficit approach that's so focused on the immediate cost of building something without considering the long-term value that it provides people. And that, as Ganesh Nana talked about the other day, when you buy a home, you don't think of it as an immediate cost and deficit that you have to pay back. Obviously, you want to pay it back as quickly as possible, but, it's a long-term investment in the future of your family that provides shelter and good health and all of those sorts of things. And it concerns me. I wonder, in 20 years' time, are we going to have, bridges collapsing all over the country because we refuse to, fix them up properly or build better ones? Or
well, we did. We had a cyclone, and they did. They literally did, didn't they? I mean, that's the scale of the challenge when there's a growing kind of climate crisis approaching as well, right?
But look, this is the issue, right? Which has been identified by the Infrastructure Commission, which I think said that we were in the bottom, 10% of value extracted from our infrastructure spend in terms of sort of comparable countries or OECD countries, which is that we're not currently making a choice between spending more and getting a gold-plated result. We're spending more and getting the same but slower than anyone else would get, and that's really not sustainable. Part of it's about getting a workforce. Part of it is, boringly, this whole pipeline of projects, so that, because the cost of setting up a major project is sufficiently large that no player of scale is going to do it in New Zealand for what we consider large infrastructure projects, but internationally are small to mid-size, if they think that it's a one-off. And so you really need those players sort of operating here. And again, if we'd gotten onto this maybe sort of 10, 15 years earlier, back before there were sort of really strategic issues developing in the Pacific with China, we could have just sort of brought over Chinese SOEs to kind of build cities and bridges and roads wholesale. But
does it also come back to I remember when I was a kid growing up on Waiheke, there was heaps of council workers and there was bulldozers and tractors, and as soon as something went down, they could whip out and fix it, and they were working on the roads all the time, and stuff was happening. We had the Ministry of Works, and now we've got rid of all of that stuff, and we rely on private companies to come in and do these projects for us, but obviously they need to clip the ticket. And
no, there's an interview with the Prime Minister, and I think it was Heather Duplessis-Allen's interview with the Prime Minister yesterday or the day before, in which he said we need to do things differently, and she said something like the Ministry of Works, and he did not demur. He did not say no. Very demure.
He gets it. He gets it.
Just quickly on infrastructure, there was a very interesting interview on When the Facts Change with Bernard Hickey talking to Peter Nuns of the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission. So check that out if you haven't listened to it yet. In terms of the trade-off, there's a limited amount of putia. There's money's tight, Annabelle, and that's one of the reasons given for addressing the challenges faced with education around mathematics in our schools, which has been much traversed. And last week, Eric Stanford, the Minister of Education, announced that $30 million is going to be put into maths resources and teacher training for 2025. And the place that would be found was a program called Te Ahu o Te Reo Māori, which is a program that helps teachers learn Te Reo Māori, and it was found to be an inefficient use of the money. And that happened in the week immediately following Tuaki o Te Reo Māori, which was probably not the greatest timing. Does that seem like a reasonable exchange of funds?
And during Mahuru Māori, like Te Reo Māori month, this is a minister who said that she wants to create better outcomes for Māori students in the education system. Well, having teachers that are able to have some goodwill, a very basic understanding, and the ability to communicate some basic ideas in the language that is so intrinsic to your identity, you think would be a part of helping to achieve that outcome. That Te Reo Māori is being pitted against maths is such on one way, a very smart way to sell the policy, because everyone's like, oh yes, no, maths is far more important. But actually, intellectually dishonest. There's other ways that they could have paid for improving maths. But also, this still doesn't get to the heart of the issue in terms of what's happening with literacy and numeracy in New Zealand, which is that the ideology that was employed decades ago to do the whole of word learning as opposed to phonics, is really what's at the heart of our education system. And what we know is that for Māori students who are in kura kaupapa and have access to te reo and their identity and all of those things, you get better outcomes. So why you would strip this from teachers in mainstream schools where the vast majority of Māori students have to go is really unfortunate.
Ben, it's interesting that it was presented in that way, partly to reveal that there's a limited pot, but every dollar is fungible, and it didn't necessarily need to be presented in terms of we're cutting that program, whether it's running efficiently or not. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think that Erica Stanford was trying to make any kind of point, in terms of Te Reo. I mean, her bachelor's degree is, I think, in Māori studies, and from long before it was sort of fashionable in the early, turn of the century. But I think you're right that in terms of talking, sort of showing that you are making the savings in order to, pay for new programs, is something that I think is important in the education portfolio, where they've been saying, since before the election, there's no extra money. The contrast that seems to be drawn is that, the maths, the funding for the mathematics will be, translated directly into teaching in the classroom, whereas it appears, what they've concluded about the Te Reo course is that there was no way of establishing what the impact was in the classroom, was so, at the higher levels. I think the reporting concluded that a lot of the participants were doing it more for sort of personal development and satisfaction rather than to aid in teaching. On the other hand, it doesn't look like the Ministry of Education gave the providers any clear direction on how they could demonstrate that. to the Ministry of Education. So there might be a bit of sort of willful blindness there as well. Look, it's it's an example of the sometimes difficult trade-offs that I think are going to have to be made. I don't think it is necessary. If you look across the various institutions, the Education Review Office, TEC even, although that's sort of a little bit outside the sort of portfolio area, but Ministry of Education, NZQA, there is plenty of fat to cut there.
Yeah, I think
that you could get onto that before you started cutting Te Reo courses.
Well, that's right, and I certainly don't think Erica Stanford takes any relish in cutting a program like that. But you put it together with also the directive to the public service that there won't be to put aside that Te Reo program for training for staff. All these things taken together. Audrey Young did a good compendium of all the different policy functions, from the large to these quite small, quite granular examples. But it's impossible to feel as though it doesn't amount to a compelling narrative, Annabelle.
Absolutely, yeah. Te Reo Māori is not only not valued by this government, they're actively taking steps to minimise its place in Aotearoa with all of these directives. And this, whether or not Erica did a degree in Māori studies, it's kind of by the by when you're saying we have to get rid of this course, which according to the report was highly successful, overprescribed, superbly delivered, well enjoyed by the participants, so that we can fund maths books.
It's kind of interesting watching as well. Happens at the same time as there was the at Eden Park, there was the world record haka, taking it back from the French of all people on Sunday. But as much as that, watching the All Black test on Saturday night and the farewell to Sam Cane, the extent to which reo and tikanga Māori is now embedded in that All Blacks team is kind of extraordinary. A haka was given to Sam Cane, white dude, former captain, in the changing room. There was hongiing fellow players afterwards. It's really clear the extent to which this is just sewn into the idea of our most famous sports product and one of our most famous cultural exports, that these things seem to run counter to one another.
One thing that I think has flown a bit under the radar, which under normal circumstances would have been, front page news probably, was the reform of the Marine and Coastal Area Act, was introduced last week. And it goes considerably further, I think, than the government sort of had foreshadowed. Their idea was that they were correcting the Court of Appeal's interpretation of the test for customary marine title, but they've also introduced a number of amendments which really sort of start to kind of concretely define what counts as substantial use and interruption, which wasn't defined in the original test, in the original legislation, and really, really does tighten up those tests. I would say, having been around at the time, there's a lot of, much more than was intended in the 2011 Act. As an aside, I keep hearing Paul Goldsmith sort of say, well, the government's intention in 2011 was this. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Like I wrote all of the press material for the government about it. I think I've got a vague idea.
If you actually want to hear more on that, we did an interview with Annette Sykes on Mata yesterday. She has some interesting insights on, what those amendments mean for Māori.
Mata's available on all podcast
Funny you say that, it
providers,
is.
Isn't it? Yeah. Quickly before we go, we got to go, but we can't go without just touching on Casey Costello. And I won't do anything, but I'm just like Casey Costello's relationship with advice, I think, is fascinating. In the latest example, she's pushed through cabinet a 50% cut in the tax on heated tobacco products, despite advice from the health ministry and the Treasury saying, not sure that's a great idea. And she has independent advice, which is fine, but she won't say what the independent advice is. You remember that previously she had to apologize because there was some advice that had gone through in documents that she to push through other, I think it was the freeze on inflation-adjusted taxes on tobacco, but she didn't know whence that advice came. And I just think it's an important question. Maybe Guy Espiner, who broke this story as well and is basically the pesky kid of New Zealand politics at the moment, needs to work out where this advice is, this independent advice. I'm wondering whether it's like someone is jotting it on a napkin during koru hour and just sliding it under the drink. Any other thoughts on the source of the independent advice?
I think you're missing the point, which is that tech companies around the world, buoyed by investment from retail investors and the richest people on earth, have poured billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into creating generative AI that, will give you an answer to a question which, they can't explain. They just tell you the correct answer based on all the knowledge of the universe. And, if you ask them to cite it, they can't tell you why. They just know. Nobody can fathom the complexity and sophistication of the algorithm that leads to that answer. And New Zealand First have just produced that as a first-term MP.
Wow.
Wow. Why with your limited mind, try and even comprehend how Casey Costello forms her policy views?
I reckon what we should do is reconvene. Do you remember there used to be a show on Māori TV called Ask Your Aunties?
Oh, yeah.
Like an advice show with all these.
Great show.
Yeah, great show. We could reconvene them. They can meet with Costello once a week and give her some great auntie advice that's not anonymous and very much on the record. We could record it, broadcast it, award-winning television.
These are all good ideas. And we'll have more good ideas next time on Gone by Lunchtime.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spinoff Podcast Network.